Jeg har fått jobben å plukke opp tråden fra de to veldig flotte presentasjonene vi har akkurat hørt. De jo ganske altså, de kommer fra et land, og det noen cases som kanskje litt annerledes sånn rent sånn størrelsemessig for oss. Men jeg tror det sikkert mange av dere som sitter med det kjenner igjen temaene, og dere har kanskje noen spørsmål. Så jeg skal begynne å snakke veldig kjapt, ha noen spørsmål som jeg har forberedt først, og så hvis dere sitter inne med noen spørsmål, så slipper vi dere til sånn mot slutten. Jeg håper det går bra. Jeg håper at dere har noen spørsmål. Okay. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you very much for two very interesting and inspiring presentations that you just shared with us today. I think it's interesting to hear just how, despite the size of your institutions, or the organization that you represent, which basically includes 11 organizations, and there are massive global brands, the New York City Ballet and the Opera, for many of us, and also being situated in Manhattan, which is for many of us the sort of the global center of arts attendance, you are still striving every single day to become more relevant, be more relevant, and to always to seek more and new audiences. And I just find that quite interesting that even with 6.5 million engaged people every single year, which is basically the entire Norwegian population and then some, every single year, this is still something that's at the heart of your organization. Or is that the impression? It's still very much a part of your daily routines.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Can you, for most of us, no one in Norway, I think, can boast of 6.5 million visitors a year. Scalability. Is this something that we can do in smaller, not just smaller organizations, but actually a much smaller country with a completely different infrastructure in terms of funding and sort of cultural policy, the cultural political infrastructure that we have here in Norway?
I think the conditions, from what I understand here, I think the conditions in smaller communities lend themselves to this kind of work in a more easier way. So one of the things that actually plays against us is our size, right? When we think about impact as being hyper-local, the fact that we are so big actually it makes it more challenging for us. One of the programs that I shared up on the portfolio earlier was Cultural Innovation Grants. And that's a program where we identify small to mid-sized organizations across New York City that are doing amazing work around cultural participation. And we define cultural innovation through the lens of participation. And if you can tell us that you are being innovated in terms of who's participating, where they're participating, or how they're participating, then we will celebrate you by giving you this grant. An institution that's smaller and more nimble has an easier time of responding and engaging with their communities in ways that we just can't because we're so big. So what Kathryn and I have in common, I think, is that we both sometimes go rogue because the institution is so big and the community that we are part of is so big that for us to move quickly and be responsive is actually not in our DNA as it might be with smaller institutions that are more embedded within their communities.
I'd fully agree with that.
Well, I find it, you said you're in your experience, when you come to Europe for a few years ago, it was, how can we learn about your programming? Whilst now it's more about, or increasingly more about the governance structure. Mm-hmm. And you also said that this is something that, you have to do to be relevant and to develop those relationships with the private sector. If you had the choice, would you not do it? Does it have an add-on than just sort of having to find funding?
I think there are two absolutes, right? I think the conversation that I mentioned earlier, I was in Spain a few months ago, and the conversation we were having is that it shouldn't be black and white. Is that the great thing about private funding is that you have more freedom and more flexibility, presumably, but you also have less ability to plan long term because we don't have any sort of guaranteed or safe assumption that money will return. So there are pros and cons, and I think what I take away from these conversations is what might a world look like in where there's a combined or there's a mixed model where there is a more diversified source of revenue as opposed to it being all public or all private.
Yeah. Just my sort of thought was, if you had to choose between one incentive, would it be that you have to, or that you want to work in becoming relevant and working on that position in your community?
Well, go ahead.
Oh, I think for me, it's because I want to. I think working on these kind of projects is really fun, and I think you get to try out lots of new things. And I do think there's a part of me thinks that we have to become more relevant, but also it's just we want to. We're in an industry that's constantly changing and coming up with new creative projects to present, and so it's really fun, and we want to do it as well.
It impacts the work that you're doing, yeah.
And part of the narrative for us is we don't come to spaces like these and events like these to say you need to do this or anybody needs to do this. We sort of had to explore these possibilities out of necessity, but we are now stronger institutions because of it. And so I'm really interested in having the conversation, well, who wants to do this not out of necessity but out of desire, because it actually does make you a more impactful institution. And talking about cultural institutions as civic institutions is not an easy conversation to have depending on who you're talking to, but to me it's the right conversation to have at this moment in time.
I love the sentence that you had about how does New York affect or impact Lincoln Center, and having to make that sort of change in, I suppose, the way that the organization is structured, and such a big organization, how easy is it to maneuver and to make that kind of change?
Well, that part for us is easier, because when you think about our product, our inventory is 3,000 performances a year between all of us. So to say that in a place as diverse as New York City, that any New Yorker should find themselves at Lincoln Center when you have an inventory of 3,000 events should be relatively easy, because it's not all 3,000 events opera, 3,000 events ballet. You have a nice mix. So, and we are partly responsible for those 3,000, a chunk of it, a piece of the pie. So how do we tweak it so that we are being responsive to what we learn? Because I think one of the things for both of us is we can get people to Lincoln Center one time, but then when we take the training wheels off, will they want to continue coming?
And how do you, that's obviously something that I'm sure you work on. How do you, so a lot of the big effort is to try and get people through the doors the first time. That's the big chunk of the work. But how do you then re-engage, and how do you know that they're being re-engaged? Are you following them? Do you know who they are? And because from what I understood, the organization, you're an umbrella organization, and the tickets and the sales and the activities, they sort of are organized in the 11 or the 10 other different institutions. So how does that sort of ecosystem work? Do you know who all these people are, or are you in?
We know who a lot of our people are, especially the ones that are buying tickets to our performances. And we are taking note of what their interests are. So when we market different performances to people, we know if this person likes Beethoven, or if this person attended a dance show, they might like this one. So that is something that we're constantly thinking about and trying to do. But in terms of sharing data more broadly across all of the constituent organizations, we haven't quite gotten there yet, which makes it really difficult because we don't know who all these 6.5 million people are and how to engage with them. But we're trying to get there.
Yeah. I think, everyone is, yes.
I know, and the data is there, right? The data is, so the 11, they individually might have their own data, but it's getting everybody to open up that's challenging. And I think to us, a perfect world. So for those of you that engage with Netflix, our goal is to say, well, if you enjoyed this, you might want to try this. And when we have 3,000 performances a year, that should be relatively easy for us from an inventory perspective. But to Kathryn's point, if we're not openly sharing the data, it's challenging.
I just loved the three cases that you presented with the Young Patrons program, and your sort of work on. So you had the Yay Beethoven, your email campaigns, or your digital campaigning, and the festival, the concerts, which, and obviously they must be quite different in terms of resources and how much it costs, and what would you recommend if you were just going to do one thing? What would be the most effective way of re-engaging or talking to the millennials?
I feel like the thing that kind of crosses the three of those cases is our just knowing that not all millennials are the same, so you have to talk to people in different ways. So I think it's pretty easy to edit copy for different social ads and email campaigns so that you're hitting these different segments. I think that's probably a good place to start. That's also something that you can apply to any show. But the programming piece for Beethoven and K-Factor, I think, has allowed us to really try and test some of those new social and email initiatives, because like I said, our audience, the average age is 68. So we've mostly been talking to that age of person. And so these kind of shows allow us to reach beyond that and try out what is it like trying to reach a 20-something.
How risky is a project like that?
It's very risky. Extremely risky, as Alex said. We're both kind of known for going rogue, and for both of them, I mean, we got quite a bit of pushback from Lincoln Center. But when you can prove success, now everyone wants to do more of it, and we're actually turning this into a new series that will launch next year.
It's quite impressive. So 900.
For Beethoven, it was over 900 attendees, and then 500 of them had never been to Lincoln Center before.
That's quite impressive. But I just want to retouch on, you talked about in your presentation, Alex, about there's a need to a renewed commitment for social impact. Mm-hmm. Is there a need for a renewed sort of alignment for social impact? Is this something that's sort of coming up again, or is this something that's been present all the time?
I think it's present. I mean, I think we all do what we do because we understand the transformative power of the arts. None of us got into this work because we wanted to be rich, right? None of us got into this. So I think there's something inherently aligned between the arts and social impact. But we have, as a community, at least in the United States, as a community, we have never known how to tell the story to completion. We have always stopped by saying, oh, we put on shows. And if you build it, they will come. And then I think what we're both trying to do is we're actually trying to engage in conversation and say, okay, what is the measurable impact if the arts are so transformative? And how do we tell that story so that the arts do become a civic right and not something that is just affordable to people at a certain income level? And so really the thing that led to this is when I started at Lincoln Center 7 years ago, we said we paid a consulting firm way too much money to tell us the obvious, but we asked them, why are people not coming to Lincoln Center? And they said there are three main barriers. There's geographic barriers, which hopefully one day will be overcome with digital technology. The second barrier is financial, which to us was interesting because a lot of what we do is discounted or free, which leads to the third barrier, which is the perceived barrier that Lincoln Center doesn't belong to me and I don't belong to Lincoln Center. And so my work is really trying to take down that barrier by saying you actually belong here, and that's why it's a dialogue and not impact. It's not Lincoln Center, with a savior mentality coming out and saying we're going to save the world. It's saying, well, what can we do to make your life better? And that dialogue, which Kathryn does in her own way with her steering committee, is something that we try to do across the board.
How are you measuring this impact? Are you measuring it? Is this something that you're able to sort of prove and document as you're going along?
We do.
And is that necessary, do you think?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, partly because we need to demonstrate impact to our funders. So when the one thing I didn't actually go into detail about is every single dot in that map I showed at the end is part of a portfolio of programs that fall under education, like it's one of those many different programs. Each one of those programs is held accountable to its own definition of success. So if it's a school program, it has its own measurable outcomes. If it's a teen program, it has its own measurable outcomes. If it's about arts and autism, it has. So in the same way that it's a portfolio approach to impact and collective impact, the research needs to be, the way we engage in research needs to be as complex so that we can, so that every program is being measured by its own, is being held accountable to its own purpose, but that the research can also bubble up to tell a larger story.
I think we're going to start opening up for questions, but I just wanted to have a quick question to you, Kathryn. So your average, you talked about the average age of the Lincoln Center in general was 68. Mm-hmm. So with the introduction of the Young Patrons Program, do you know if you've managed to lower that average age? Are you making an impact?
Yes, we are making an impact. And I don't know what that number is off the top of my head, but we do report outs after every one of our major festivals and series, and we've been able to see that we are selling more tickets to younger people, and that percentage is going up every time.
And is the work that you're doing, is there any sort of, obviously you then have a core audience at the Lincoln Center, which is a different demographic in many ways than the one that you're working with. Or do you experience any sort of conflict in those sort of the core audience and the millennials?
I think only when we try to present things like Beethoven and K-Factor and things that are a little more avant-garde, if you will. I think those kind of programs don't draw an older audience necessarily, so their interest in programming is definitely different. But no real conflict. It would just be people going to different shows.
Yeah. Does anyone in the audience, do you have any burning questions that you'd like to ask? Det var en her nede. Nå ser ikke jeg så langt bak, for det er så mørkt, men så dere må kanskje veive litt.
Hello, my name is Gerdis. I'm from the Munch Museum. Thank you so much for this presentation. It was really engaging. I was just curious, because in a sense, I feel familiar with some of your ideas. And I was just wondering, because an art institution usually would put on great art, and that would be the goal. And now I'm just asking myself if this goal actually changed, and that you're talking about is actually to change that goal from great art to great engagement. Is that true, or would this be something that goes only to first-time visitors?
Is that for me or just in general?
In general, for both of you. Yeah, thank you.
I mean, I think it is more about. So one of the things that is very complicated for us to talk about is artistic excellence, because it used to be that artistic excellence would attract an audience, and what we're finding is that people that didn't come to Lincoln Center is because they didn't agree with our version of excellence, right? And so we needed to reestablish and redefine. Well, is it more about energy? Is it more about engagement? Is it more about there's an excellence to the engagement strategy as opposed to an artistic excellence? I mean, we take it for granted that everything you will see at Lincoln Center from a technical standpoint will be of the highest quality. But from a curatorial perspective, we try to have a diversity of opinions. The one thing that's relatively new for us is there's intentionality in how we are going out into the community. So it's one thing to say we want to do community engagement. It's another thing to say, okay, we started working with our marketing department and we said, okay, show me on a map people that buy tickets to Lincoln Center, where are they coming from? So on a map, they showed us, well, ticket buyers are coming from these neighborhoods and these area codes. So in my mind, well, my work, I can spend some time and resources engaging them on a deeper level, or I could say, I'm going to actually look at where there's a desert in New York City where there are no pins because nobody's coming to Lincoln Center, and say, how do I attract you here in ways that is culturally responsive, in a way that is mindful. I introduce you to everything that Lincoln Center has to offer, and we have some programs where it's about family engagement. We partner with social service agencies that have access to families that live at a certain income level. And we say, bring them to Lincoln Center 3 to 5 times a year for no money. You'll see the Nutcracker at New York City Ballet, orchestra level seats. There's going to be a dinner beforehand. It's a 2-year commitment. And then after 2 years, we say, okay, we're going to take the training wheels off. And if we've done everything right, you will continue coming on your own. And that's why having an impact on us is so important, because if we take the training wheels off and they don't come back, then what have we been doing for 2 years? So the point is, how are we demonstrating that we are being responsive so that by the time we make it obvious that the barriers have been crumbled, that they still want to come. So there's intentionality and strategy in how we think about this long term. I hope that answered your question. Okay.
My name is Hanne Beate Ueland, and I'm director for the Art Museum in Stavanger, a bit south of Bergen. So you should come next time. Thank you so much, both of you, for very inspiring presentations. And I have a question similar to the first question, actually, to Kathryn, about the programming of your upcoming series of concerts. So you touched upon it, but maybe you could explain a little bit more on how you put together these programs. So you have the young people attending or engaging in the programming itself, and how does that sort of affect your curators and the staff of curators? So it's a similar kind of question, but it's very interesting to learn more about that, because how it affects how we program, and how our curatorial staff programs.
Yeah, so I on these kind of shows, I work with sort of a collective of artists that essentially pitch ideas to us, and it's kind of about what do we think would be a good fit for Lincoln Center. We run everything by the committee that I mentioned, so they really weigh in on really every programming decision that we make. But from there, it's really building these kind of shows from the ground up. I mean, they haven't existed before we choose to do them. I think something that's really interesting about them, and it's what we're thinking about in terms of building this series out moving forward, is we want all of these kind of shows like Beethoven and K Factor to be about an idea, that it's not just going to see a show just to see a show, but there's an actual idea behind it that people can get around and talk about. So both of these, they were part of our Young Patrons program, but have kind of taken off. So I mentioned before, we're turning them into a series, and that's really to get us out of doing them as one-offs and putting them under a complete new brand that'll hopefully gain a following over time. So we'll see what happens with that, but hopefully that answers your question.
Do we have time for one more question? No? Nope. Okay, I think our time is up, and I'm sure there are more questions. So you'll be around for the rest of the day.
Yes.
So if anyone wants to have a quick chat, I'm sure you'll be happy to help. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.